Hello, Amherst! Woo! Yeah. That's like the most funny I'm going to be tonight. Hi. So I posted on Facebook that I was going to be introducing this film and was going to be talking about science. And my friends all made fun of me. They asked me such things as, will you explain the engineering behind the love pump? Or the combustion point of drummers. See, if you know this movie, this is funny. Otherwise, you're like, what the hell is Steve talking about? Can we assume you'll cover the methodology by which D minor is calculated as the saddest of all keys? That was asked by a musicologist, of course. And have you finally solved the scientific mystery of how one dusts for vomit? Which I have not yet. So there are a lot of possible avenues into this movie. But the one that I have chosen, my favorite bit, if you will, has to do with this. Guitarist Nigel Tufnell shows off his specially designed Marshall amp with volume and tone knobs that go not to the standard 10, but to 11. It's one louder, the guitarist emphasizes with glee. When director Marty DiBergi, who's played by Rob Reiner, reasonably asks, why not just make 10 louder? Nigel pauses with confusion and reasserts, these go to 11. Now, we laugh because we know that Nigel's excitement about this is basically nonsense, right? Like, Marty is right. An amp can go to 10 or it can go to 11. It doesn't mean it's actually louder. It's just a number. To be able to go to 11 is just a symbolic thing. It allows a player like Nigel to think that he can go beyond the maximum volume, right? I'm going past 10. But that desire to go to 11 is also based on something real, if intangible. It's tied up with the reasons why the electric guitar became such a potent symbol of a range of values that struck a chord in the mid to late 20th century and continue to resonate today. The assertion of power, the ability to transcend limits, mastery of technology, all seemingly accessible through the rush of sensation provoked by amplified sound. Microphones are part of this too. They're annoying. Okay, I'm going to hold this. Because this screening is part of a series called Science on Screen, I'm going to do my best to illuminate some of the factors that make amplification possible, right? How do we get to 11? And allow the electric guitar to achieve the effects that it does. I will note that I am no kind of scientist, really. But I am a historian who's written extensively about the electric guitar and has a long-standing interest in how the instrument was invented and how it has evolved. So that's where I'm starting. I wrote a book on the subject, if you're interested. It's called Instruments of Desire, the Electric Guitar and the Shaping of Musical Experience. Some of what you will hear today is from that book. Some of it is not. So let me start with what might be a surprising fact. Amplification effectively begins with the invention of the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell patented the first electric loudspeaker in 1876 as part of his design for the telephone. You see part of the original patent here. By the way, because this is science and we're allowed to be super nerdy about this, if you are as nerdy as I am about things having to do with technology and with guitars and stuff, Google Patents has like all this stuff online. And it's really kind of fun to just poke around and be like, hey, can I find like that guitar design from 1942? So I'll be showing you a few things like that. Now clearly in the context of a telephone, this is not a speaker that we want to turn up to 11, because then we go deaf. But it laid the groundwork for subsequent developments. In this instance, the loudspeaker existed as the endpoint of the process according to which Bell's telephone would convert the sound of a voice, a speaking voice, into an electronic signal that would be conducted across a wire to a receiver, where the signal would be converted back into intelligible sound and amplified into the listener's ear. Now, as different as they are, the telephone and the electric guitar operate according to the same basic principle, which has to do with the concept of transduction. Transduction is a phenomenon that refers to a wide variety of processes. It's the term for any circumstance in which one kind of signal is converted into another. Hey, I'm talking about science now. For scientists of sound like Alexander Graham Bell, the human ear was the ultimate transducer for its ability to convert auditory vibrations into the sounds that we perceive. As conceived by Bell, the receiver of the telephone was an analogous kind of transducer to the ear itself. So much so that he even devised an early device called a phonautograph that used an actual human ear. See that squiggly thing up there? That's an ear. Like an actual ear. Ew? Yeah, let's just go. Ew. The electric guitar depended on a similar device, but did not include an ear. And I'll explain that momentarily. But first, we need to explore something further to understand how loudspeakers actually became loud. So it wasn't until the early 20th century that the technology existed to allow amplification as we know it to have properly functioned. Being very methodical here, but I think this is important, right? You think like, how does an electric guitar become electric? Well, there are preconditions. Having a speaker is one, having an amplifier is another. The key development here was the creation of the vacuum tube, the first instance of which was invented by the independent inventor Lee DeForest. DeForest's Audion tube, and again, you can see the patent here, patented in 1908, consisted of three primary elements: a metal plate that would heat up and conduct electrons, a second metal plate that would remain cool and attract the electrons from the first plate, and a piece of filament that would act as a grid between the two plates. And on this design, in case you can't tell, the actual tube is up there where it's like DFAZ. That's the tube, the Audion. DeForest also determined a process to eliminate air from the tube, which would allow the circulation of the current to be uninterrupted by outside elements, thus making it a vacuum tube. This design permitted the signal transmitted by the first heated plate, which is called the cathode, to be considerably amplified as it moved to the second cool plate, called the anode. And here's an actual Audion tube. This is one of the original ones that DeForest devised in the early 1900s. DeForest's Audion tube found its first and primary use in the strengthening of radio transmission signals, and then played a parallel role in consolidating telephone networks. A new wave of inventors also figured out that the tube could help to dramatically increase the output of an audio system, given that the underlying purpose of the vacuum tube was the amplification of a signal. So at this point, we've got two key things, right? The loudspeaker offered the capacity to project an electronic signal. The amplifier provides a way to boost the signal and make it louder, which is what we want. Once these interrelated innovations were in place, they gave rise to further efforts to exploit and refine the technical capacities that were at work. We get a new loudspeaker design in 1925, devised by two inventors, Chester Rice and Edward Kellogg, who worked for General Electric. And the innovation here is that they use a coil that exists within a magnetic field, and it functions as another sort of transducer. It transmits vibrations to the speaker diaphragm, and that becomes the basis for amplifying the sound. The coil in question is, again, kind of up in the upper right of what you're looking at, where you see a little bit of a wound thing around a bar. That's the coil in question. And here's the actual speaker as it was devised. And this type of speaker that's created in 1925 is called a moving coil loudspeaker, really is the basis for the speakers that we still use today. So this really consolidated something important. So by the 1920s, then, amplification was becoming more of a common fact of life. Telephones, radios, and gramophones employed it in common everyday domestic settings and in public life. Movie theaters, like this one, but older, began to feature amplified sound as well, with the first successful system for bringing sound to the cinema being refined in 1927. Microphones, like this one, started to appear in public spaces, allowing singers and speakers to have their voices heard with new volume. Amidst all this activity, the effort to apply amplification to guitars and other musical instruments assumed greater currency among a range of inventors as well. Here, the fundamental innovation was a device called a pickup. Yay, they're fun. The pickup was another sort of transducer, designed in this case to convert the vibrations resulting from the plucked string of a guitar into an electronic signal that would be transmitted to an amplifier and then made audible through the attached speaker. Pickups were not new with the electric guitar. They exist in phonograph needles, for instance. There also were a surprising number of efforts to create amplified instruments in the 1920s, but more often than not, it was like a violin. Guitars were not the primary object until we get a little bit further along. So it's not until the early 1930s that you get an electric guitar actually emerge for the first time. And it's not until 1937 that you actually get the first patented design of an electric guitar. Not the first, but the best. The one that mattered. And that patent was awarded to a guy named George Beecham, who worked first for the National Guitar Company and then moved to Rickenbacker, which is a company whose name I think many of us who are guitar geeks, like me, know well. Rickenbacker was named after a person named Adolf Rickenbacker, and him and Beecham were in partnership in this company. When he was working for National, Beecham worked closely with an instrument maker named John DiBergi on the design of an acoustic resonating guitar, such as the one you see here, that would achieve an amplifying effect through the use of a set of aluminum cones that magnified the sound generated by the guitar's vibrating strings. And this sort of mechanical amplification was an important precursor to the more properly amplified guitar, but it has obvious limits in terms of how loud you can go, right? It's not by any stretch an electric guitar, but it is a kind of amplified guitar. It was with Rickenbacker that Beecham implemented the innovation that made the electric guitar into a reproducible and sellable commodity. In 1931, Beecham built the prototype for a guitar that would come to be known as the frying pan. Guess why? While many things set the frying pan apart from other guitars of the day, like it was made out of metal, the pickup design was the standout feature with regard to its success as an electric guitar. For those who are guitarists, it's probably worth knowing, or for those who are interested in guitars, it's probably worth knowing that this would have been played as a steel guitar. So you would have played it on your lap as a lap steel, not upright as what would have been called a Spanish-style guitar at the time. So the pickup is this thing. And that's really the key feature in terms of its being an electric guitar. Like other amplifying devices, the pickup worked by generating an electromagnetic field that captured sound vibrations and transmitted them to the attached speaker and amplifier. This is the patent that Beecham filed for this instrument. You can see the instrument design here. The pickup design specifically is up there, and you get a little isolated version of the pickup right there on the right. Beecham's pickup was distinguished by the use of 6 separate magnetic coils, one for each of the guitar's strings. Earlier efforts to amplify the guitar had not isolated the vibration of the individual strings as successfully, and so did not produce either desired volume or clarity of sound. The inventor highlighted the unique features of his instrument in the patent application, where he explained that it does not depend on a soundboard, resonance box, or the like in the production or propagation of the sound of the desired quality, whereby the body of the instrument may be of simple, inexpensive construction. Thus, he made it out of metal, making it durable, making it really heavy, but also kind of signaling that you didn't have to make just a regular old guitar in order to do this. Now, I could continue going on along this way, but there's only so much time here. And this is really the milestone. This is where the electric guitar actually exists as a thing in the world, circa 1931-32. So having established that, all further advances basically stem from the frying pan, whether you're talking about a Stratocaster or a Gibson Les Paul or a BC Rich, which I think is more the kind of guitar that you see being played in Spinal Tap, which was a really goofy shaped, very pointy electric guitar that was popular for about 3 years in the 1980s. With the remainder of the time I have, however much that is, I would like to talk more generally about two aspects of the topic of amplification that I think are especially germane and a little more abstracted. So we're departing from the teleology and more just getting into the concept. And the two things I'm going to talk about here are volume and distortion, right? Volume is pretty crucial. If we're talking about going to 11, we're basically talking about making things louder. How does that happen? Volume is measured by the amplitude of a given sound. The larger the sound wave, the louder the sound, with the caveat that loudness has a significant psychoacoustic component as well. What is overwhelmingly loud to one person may be just right to another. Rock fans tend to like things loud. When you turn the volume knob on an amp from low to high, you're increasing the amount of electrical current that flows into the circuit, which in turn intensifies the electromagnetic motion that is generated by the string vibrations, and so generates sound with a larger amplitude level. Any given amplification system has a built-in limit, typically expressed as a measurement of watts. But the curious thing about watts, and this is true for decibel measures as well, right, which is another way of signaling loudness, is that increasing the wattage only increases loudness so much. So you would think like, oh, if you buy a 20 watt amp, it's like twice as loud as a 10 watt amp, but it's not. It's like just a little bit louder. So in order to actually get a significant boost, you have to go way, way higher in wattage. So a 100 watt amp is twice as loud as a 10 watt amp. File that one away. Be a good Jeopardy answer someday. Okay, so distortion. There are two aspects of distortion I want to highlight. First is just the mechanical part. Distortion is what results when you push a system past its capacity. Turning a guitar amp up to 10 or 11 will often result in a signal that is less clear than the sound you get if you turn it up to, say, 4. I tend to turn mine up to 1. That's because I live alone in a small house and it gets really loud. It may be louder if you turn it up to 10. It's loud, it's maximum loud, but it often doesn't sound all that great. It loses resolution. That's because as a combined amplifier and speaker system reaches its upper limit, it starts to compress the waves of the sounds that it generates so as not to unduly overdrive the system. When these sound waves become compressed, they are clipped. The extreme points of the sound waves are cut off and the sound assumes a coarse edge. So you can see this visualized here, right? That's a regular amplitude signal, and this is a compressed signal on the bottom. That would result in a very sharp, coarse kind of distortion. So these clipped sounds are what we call distortion. In many instances, distortion is something to be avoided. When you're playing the beginning of Stairway to Heaven, you don't want distortion. But when you get to the really cool part at the end, you do, right? So at a certain point in time, distortion shifts from being something that people wanted to eliminate. It was seen as a flaw in the system. And then it becomes something that's not a flaw, or at least that you want to have control over. Sometimes you want distortion, sometimes you don't. And it's really a key turning point in the history of the electric guitar when distortion becomes something that people want to play with. And that basically happens in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And that brings me to my second point about distortion, which is that it represents the fact that not all sounds are created equal, right? So what we're talking about here is the term we would use for this is timbre. Timbre isn't spelled like it sounds. But timbre basically is the term we use to refer to how something sounds, the quality of the sound that we hear. A distorted timbre is a very distinctive sort of timbre. And in rock, it is often, if not always, the preferred sort of timbre. So if you turn your amp up really loud, but you have a nice clean signal, it has one sort of effect. If you turn your amp up really loud and it's distorted, that has another kind of effect. That's rock and roll, right? That's what Nigel likes. That's what he wants when he turns it up to 11. He's not trying to play a nice jazz solo. Not that that would be bad. But he wants to play something that's going to feel like you're getting kicked in the balls by sound. Without that sound, entire genres of music such as heavy metal and punk would not exist. It's the sound of rock and roll, and it's a sound that This Is Spinal Tap parodies and celebrates with equal force. So, with that, enjoy the movie, and beware of the exploding drummer. Thank you.